Well, good afternoon. My name is George Perkovich. I'm a Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. We are recognizing and have for quite some time recognized the strategic importance of Afghanistan. That's been reflected in work that Frédéric Grard has done and Ashley Tellis over the recent years. And we now have an outstanding French scholar here, Gilles Donsoro, who's now in Afghanistan. And the product of this has been a number of recent publications. I'm holding up a few. All of which are available outside, which is part of the reason for my mentioning them. One by Gilles, and then the latest report by Ashley, and then a major report by Frédéric Grard on reforming the intelligence agencies in Pakistan, which has a bearing on what's happening in Afghanistan, as perhaps Sarah will enlighten us on. That's a preliminary. It's a real honor for me to introduce Sarah Chayes. I've been a distant admirer since the NPR days, which were much of the 90s. Sarah is now an advisor to General McKiernan at ISAF. She graduated from Harvard University and then went back and got her master's there, and then began a distinguished career in radio that took you through at least most of the 90s or beyond the 90s and into the war of 2001, early 2002. And at that point, Sarah left journalism to devote her energies to Afghanistan, to rebuilding Afghanistan, informing the world as well about what was happening in Afghanistan. And that has been the focus of her work for about the last 7 years. And we're pleased to be the benefit of that information and experience here. And without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to Sarah to kind of take us through what she's thinking about and what needs to be done in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor, on the contrary, to be hosted by Carnegie and to be in this room with you folks, whom I expect have also been thinking about these issues. I mean, it's sort of coming back front burner, but I think most of the people in this room probably have been looking at Afghanistan for a while. So I don't, stop me if I'm saying things that you already know and stuff like that. And what I'd just like to mention briefly is sort of where I come to you from. I did leave journalism early 2002 at the invitation, actually, of President Karzai's uncle. Who it's a Karzai family trait. They pop the question as you're walking out the door. I had a wonderful dinner with him as I was, winding up my rotation, and my, replacement had come in and stuff like that. And he said, "Wouldn't you come back and help us?" And I thought with my mouth, which is my trait. I said yes before I really registered what he had actually said. And so I worked very closely with them for about the first 3 years that I was there, in particular President Karzai's older brother, and launched an NGO that he had kind of put together but didn't have any reality on the ground. And we got involved in all sorts of stuff. And I would say that one of our more iconoclastic attributes was that we didn't see this hermetic barrier between humanitarian action on the ground and policy, thought and discussion. And that's something that I've kind of kept up with, I would say, that is a little bit unkosher, as it were, that you work on the ground at a grassroots level, and normally humanitarian or development organizations tend not to make declarations or participate in the policy debate. Whereas I actually think that it's precisely because you're working on the ground that you get the kind of granular sense of reality needed to inform those debates. And so that's really what I've continued to do. I left that organization in the beginning of 2004 and got involved in more directly economic activities, most recently since spring of 2005, running a cooperative that manufactures high quality skincare products for export. And we export this stuff. It's mostly soap and body oils, and we export to the United States and Canada and sell out. I mean, it really is a demonstration of what is possible. It's small, more a demonstration than a macroeconomic project, but we do have both men and women, 13 people plus me. Of those 13, 9 different tribes and ethnic groups are represented. The women are mostly from town. This is in Kandahar, so we're doing this in an active theater of war, which is interesting from a business perspective. And the men are mostly, with one exception, they are small landowners, or their families are small landowners from villages around Kandahar. So although we are small, we do kind of represent a cross-section of the population. And so I'm telling you all this to let you know that what I will be saying is based in that kind of an embeddedness in the population. No barbed wire, no sandbags, no armored vehicles. We function more or less. I mean, we do carry some hardware now, but that's more an honor issue than a protection issue. I've just begun working for General McKiernan at ISAF headquarters in Kabul as a special advisor with a pretty broad brief, but in particular, what he wanted me there for was precisely this, that I am more embedded over a longer period of time with the Afghan, or at least a segment of the Afghan population, than most other people in headquarters. And there really is a concerted effort to try to make this more of a population-based campaign, to use military terminology. And I kind of see myself as the demonstration of that. And I would submit that I'm not always the easiest person to have around. I mean, I started coming up to headquarters last fall, raising some issues with some of the pet projects of ISAF headquarters. And I'm very moved and honored that General McKiernan sort of, rather than saying, who is this gadfly, get her out of my, it was, hey, I need you to do this to me more than once a month. I need you to do this to me on a regular basis. And so with that long preamble, I wanted to start with a couple of opening statements, but really then turn this into a conversation as much as possible. I'd like to start by saying that the situation is not good. Now, this is not a surprise to anyone in this room, but one of the things I had a meeting with General McKiernan just before leaving to come here, and he went on leave, and let him know I would be coming to speak to you folks and some other people in Washington, or got his approval for that. And I said, you realize that I am going to describe this in slightly grayer terms than you tend to. And his first answer was, am I being too rosy? And I said, a little bit. We can talk about that later. Now, to me, that doesn't mean that success is impossible. On the contrary, I think that one of the recipes for achieving success is an accurate understanding of what the situation is. And so what I would say, I think that's helpful to get your heads around it, is that objectively, I don't think General McKiernan, for example, and myself differ very far in terms of the objective analysis of the events on the ground. The objective level of violence is significantly less than, for example, in 2006 in Iraq. If you're looking at number of bodies that show up on street corners or number of pints of blood flowing, it's less. But I think what's really important to understand is how traumatized the Afghan population is. And the point is that this is a campaign for the adherence, or to sway the Afghan population. And the Afghan population has been through 30 years of combat. And one of the things that does is break down, first of all, your assessment of risk. What I've found often is that my Afghan friends tend to either think they're totally safe or think they're about to die in the next couple of hours. And they have a hard time rationally and dispassionately kind of coming up with the gradations, assessing risk between those two ends. And that means that it actually takes a lot less bloodshed to intimidate the Afghan population than it might the Iraqi population. And it's something very important to understand, because it accounts for the discrepancy between the sort of number of events that you might see on the ground and the way Afghans are reacting to them and the way they feel about them. And how they feel about them is going to impact very significantly how they behave. So, for example, I try to explain even to incoming officers who don't understand, or officers currently in theater who don't understand, well, why is it that a villager wouldn't tell us about an IED that he sees being planted? And I say, well, here's the calculus of a villager. First of all, every time this villager interacts with his government, it hurts him. Either the local police checkpoint steals his firewood, or maybe kidnaps his son for ransom or for other things. He wants to import some auto parts from Pakistan because, he might have a little shop in town. Well, he has to pay bribes at 8 different checkpoints along the road. He may get beaten up if he refuses to pay one of those bribes. And he wants to go on pilgrimage. He has to pay a bribe to get a spot to go on pilgrimage. I mean, even his religious affairs ministry is corrupted. Meanwhile, the Taliban in his neighborhood explain quite convincingly to him that if he colludes with the government or cooperates with the government, they'll kill him. And one of the ways they make this really convincing is by killing, for example, the baker who sold some bread to the police checkpoint. Now imagine the baker. He doesn't like the police because the police is stealing his firewood too. But the police have guns and they demand some bread, and so he sells them some bread and then he gets killed by the Taliban. This is the kind of situation. Every single one of those details that I've just explained has happened in the last couple of months. Maybe not all of them to one villager, but these are all literal, events that happen right now. And so what I would say, and I'm much more familiar with the situation in the Afghan South than in the East, so I can't speak as granularly about the East. But in the South, what you have is basically all of the districts surrounding Kandahar city are pretty much under Taliban control. And when I say under Taliban control, let's look at some districts immediately to the west of Kandahar city. You've got heavy Canadian presence there. They've got combat outposts, dotting the countryside. And right within 100 yards, or let's say within maybe 500 yards of these outposts, you've got Taliban doing body searches. Anyone with a phone that takes a picture gets confiscated. The phone gets confiscated. They're taking a tithe of 10% of your crop, and we're talking a 10-minute drive outside Kandahar city here. We're not talking out in the hinterland. Your crop. They also have very good intel on how much. A friend of mine's brother underestimated his grape harvest by about a third. The Taliban corrected him. No, you didn't produce this many grapes. You produced this many grapes, and we need the tithe on this many grapes. They've got a functioning court, basically, and they're in a position to be able to intimidate people into using that court if they were tempted to use the government courts. So that's the kind of psychological, so the result is a city like Kandahar, which is really second only to Kabul, or second, let's say Herat, Kandahar, Kabul are the most important cities, Jalalabad in the country, is under this kind of psychological pressure. We just had another triple suicide bombing, I think the day before yesterday, in the provincial, not the provincial council, in the governor's palace. So my cooperative members are coming to work every day pretty much convinced that they or a member of their family is going to die in the next couple of days. And when you look at a population-based campaign, how can you start to kind of push back this pressure cooker of fear that the people are living under? It becomes a very complicated proposition. And it's a proposition also where our mistakes really don't help very much. I mean, and those mistakes are not just civilian casualties, they're also property damage, which gets a lot less coverage in the press. But, for example, a lot of the operations in Kandahar have taken place, with maneuver units basically driving through people's vineyards. Now, a vineyard, again, you can assess a value to a grapevine, and at best, you pay compensation and the family gets some cash. Well, families, we all know what happens to cash, right? I mean, we all humans suffer this. The point of a grapevine is that is something that a father bequeaths to his children. That is a legacy. And it's, you destroy the legacy that a family was going to bequeath to the next generation. It's tremendously important. And so what I would say is that we're looking at a situation where people are under a lot of pressure of intimidation, but they're also becoming enraged. And they're enraged at the way we are behaving, and they're enraged at the way their own government officials are behaving without a lot of whistleblowing happening on our part. And this is one of the major, how to put it, kind of cognitive disconnects that I experience when I toggle back and forth between my Afghan environment and my international environment, is my international environment is telling me, but this is an Afghan, a sovereign Afghan government, legitimate and elected, and so we can't really interfere too much. And my Afghan environment is telling me, what are you people talking about? We threw these bums out in 1994. It's one of the few things that we're happy with the Taliban for having done. You guys brought them back in because they said they would help you fight Al-Qaeda or whatever. You empowered them, you armed them, you clothed them, you equipped them, you provided them with development projects, you provided them with humanitarian, assistance that they could direct, And now you're telling us that you want to step back and not interfere? You interfered in installing these people. You gave them free rein. We need you to kind of level that playing field again. And I'm talking about this in general terms, but I also mean with regard to the election, which is something we can get into if anybody wants to. So that's kind of a slightly grim view of the situation, where people are both under tremendous psychological pressure and are very angry at the way they're being treated by their government and what they experience to be the impossibility of obtaining redress for their grievances. That being said, what did we call this? Is success possible? Emphatically, yes. Emphatically, success is possible in Afghanistan. And I would not be working for ISAF. I just took a job with ISAF. I wouldn't have taken that job if I thought that this was hopeless. It's on the contrary, because I think it's possible and because I think that we have a miraculous kind of new juncture this summer that I really felt like this is the time to put the afterburners on. Why I wanted to start with the grim view is I wanted you to understand how urgent this is. You've got to think Iraq 2006. Even though it doesn't look that bad, you have to think do or die. This is the do or die moment for Afghanistan. It means we have to put on the same kind of afterburners. We have to devote the same level of talent, of energy, of risk, of willingness to really change the paradigm if we want to turn this around, not just for Afghanistan and not just for the United States, but I would submit really to impact what the world is going to look like this century. That's why I think this is so important. So here's some of the kind of underlying reasons why I think success is possible. And what I want to do with this is shatter a few of the kind of received wisdoms that I've been hearing floating around this town in the last few months. Number one, Afghanistan is not some kind of irrevocably tribal, backward place that's never been governed from the center or had a government. This is something I keep on hearing, and it's like, where did this come from? And when you start looking at the supporting evidence in favor of this description of Afghanistan, I find that the documents fall into two categories. Either 19th century British colonial reports, for example, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who wrote about Afghanistan in 1809, right? Well, I would submit that neither Germany nor Italy were particularly well-organized countries in 1809. And I would submit that none of us would look at a description of Italians written in 1809 and claim that it accurately represents Italians today. And the second source of documents tend to be people who have focused their analysis of Afghanistan on the 1980s, which was a period when the country was coming under attack by a neighboring superpower. Well, that had a disruptive impact on the central government, kind of naturally. And I think that it is an intellectual distortion to use the period of the 1980s to extrapolate from that to a timeless norm for Afghanistan. So let me just kind of put back on the table my understanding of Afghan history. The country was founded in 1747. That beats the United States by a couple of decades. It has been governed from the center by a respected, not perfect or perfectly there are lots of criticisms one could make of various phases of the Afghan central government, but has been governed from the center for most of the last century. With its writ extending to villages, with what Afghans tell me is that, a lone policeman unarmed could go out into a village and detain a suspect for questioning in a criminal case in town. That was kind of their measure of the government. You had civil liberties expanding. You had cultural, kind of flowering going on, particularly 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on. What I would say, I think a more useful way of thinking of tribal social organization is as a dual citizenship. And that's something that Americans, I think, we can get our heads around, is we're all the citizens of our states while we're citizens of the United States of America, and we don't see those two things as being in conflict. They're two simultaneous allegiances with different claims on our obedience and our identification. I think it's accurate to say that in Afghanistan, and this is again going to be slightly counterintuitive, what I found is that rather than Afghans uniting when they come under attack, they actually dissolve. They dissolve their nation state, and they fall back on their tribal structures as a platform for fighting back. And that's what happened during the 1980s. And, it was a decade. It took a long time. And to some extent, those tribal structures almost got over. It was like tribal structures on steroids or cancer, that they grew, getting these huge infusions of money and Stinger missiles and weaponry and stuff like that. They kind of grew beyond the capacity of their tribesmen to rein in. And so the way I would see the arrival of the Taliban in 1994 is not an ideological revolution. In fact, Afghans didn't really have much time for extremist Islamist ideology or political Islam. They needed a government. They had been suffering under 4 or 5 years of extremely violent, chaotic civil strife based on these kind of tribal structures on steroids. And the Taliban were the only kind of alternative that looked like a government on offer. And what you basically had was people throwing up their hands. Let me take the cancer analogy a step further and say it was a very painful operation that the cancer patient had to undergo in order to get the cancer tumors cut out of the body politic. And I would suggest that what we're experiencing now is kind of a repeat of that, because the government that we, the international community, has empowered is rampant chaos. It really is. And so you see people out of intimidation, out of anger, and out of desperation turning once again to the Taliban as an alternative. Similarly, and I think I don't need to belabor this, I don't see this conflict as irrevocably ideological or ideological at all. I have to say, having lived in a number of different countries in my time, Afghans are just about the least ideological people I've ever encountered. They are extraordinarily practical, including in their experience and practice of Islam, and including in my experience of how they interact with me. A lot of people say, now wait a second, you're an American female with a bare face driving around Kandahar, Afghanistan. How is this possible? And my answer to that is Afghans interact with me very practically based on their experience of me, based on how I behave, how I function in the society. And basically I have an advantage being an international female that an Afghan female wouldn't enjoy. But basically, I am understood and experienced as a male, to the point that I've got a tribal shura that is asking me to be the head of the tribal shura. It's totally extraordinary. I say, wait a second, I can't do this. I'm an American. And they say, well, if you won't be the leader of the shura, at least we want to be able to check in with you and get your advice when we make any decision. And I'm as blown away as maybe some of you might be. And I'm not saying this to toot my horn and say that I'm extraordinary. I'm saying that Afghans are practical and they respond based on their experience of events. And so what I would say is that throughout 2002, absolutely no presence of what we're now calling the insurgency in southern Afghanistan, in Mullah Omar's heartland. None of it. People were overjoyed at the presence of the international community. They were inspired by the Karzai government. They wanted to rejoin the international community. They wanted to educate their children. They wanted to get a competent government. They wanted to get a government that was responsive, responsible, that they had some say in their collective destiny. And they thought we were the guys who would, be providing them with that. And how this has morphed into what looks like an insurgency, again, belaboring the point, is a lot of very practical grievances against what they've experienced at our hands. And that's really my last point about success being possible, is what Afghans are looking for. I mean, I have to say that another thing that distressed me a little bit in the early months of this year or the early weeks of this year, was hearing all of this talk about, we're not going to make Afghanistan into the 51st state. We're not going to make Afghanistan into a Jeffersonian democracy. We're not, this lower the bar rhetoric, as though, it really started to sound a little bit, again, kind of neo-colonials to me. What? Democracy is too good for Afghans? Is that really what we're trying to say here? And let me just tell you a little story. My cooperative members, we were shooting the breeze one day. This is one illiterate young man, two who have maybe 5th, 6th grade education. So I said, hey, we're the municipal government of Kandahar. What job do you want? There are 2 more seats in front for folks, and it's no problem to come on up. Yeah.
You can tell where you run the cooperative. I'm supposed to be. I had no idea, so thank you for.
Oh, sure.
Well done.
About the cooperative?
No,
right?
about paying
seats.
attention to people. Finding
right.
The seats, so.
We're sitting, I said, okay, we're the municipal government of Kandahar. What job do you want? The illiterate guy says, I want to be the garbage collector. I'm sick of seeing refuse piling up on the public streets. It's a danger to our children. They play in it. On our street now, we have we chipped in on the street. And we each pay this little old guy with his head on a slant and a wheelbarrow, $1 a month. It's, even in Afghanistan, that's affordable. We have an immaculate street. And my guy is saying, why can't the municipal government do this? And the next guy says, I want to be the registrar of public deeds because there's too much expropriation of public land or the land of weak people by local power brokers being sold off to their cronies. I want to put a stop to that. And the third guy says, I want to be the FDA. He didn't say the FDA, but he said, I want to be the guy who goes around the bazaar and checks the weights and measures, checks when the price of wheat skyrocketed a year ago, January. We were getting bread that had ground up stale bread, like the flour was cut with ground up stale bread. Let me tell you about it. I'm not going to permit that. And I'm saying, wow. These guys know how to run a railroad. That sounds like a government to me. And the notion that it's somehow culturally sensitive to say that Afghans are tribal and they really don't want a government and they just kind of want a state of chaos. I'm caricaturing. But it really was hard to listen to. When we all in Afghanistan were saying, wow, new departure in America, new focus on Afghanistan, new devotion of resources and intellectual energy and energy, plain and simple. And frankly, what we were waiting for was some of that, yes, we can. We had been listening to yes, we can the whole campaign from Afghanistan. I'm talking the Afghans were listening to this. And they were saying, great, when are we going to get some of that? And instead what they got was, don't place the bar too high. Don't get your hopes up. Don't, So, but finally what I would say is that rhetoric, and it's what I argued to my Afghan friends, this is rhetoric aimed at the American public, and you watch, we are getting more. And sure enough, we are getting more. And this is another, I don't think in and of itself it's a game changer, but it definitely is going to make a difference. Increased troops are needed. You cannot run a population-based campaign with too few troops. You just can't, and there's some really obvious reasons why. There were times when I knew a certain district, for example, was going to come under attack. There was a moment, there's a particular district just north of Kandahar city that is the Taliban are gunning for it because it's where the jihad kicked the Soviets out of the Afghan South from. It's sort of like the Norman bocage, only worse. It's got pomegranate trees, it's got irrigation ditches, it's got walls, it's a drag. You don't want an insurgency bedded down in this district. So I knew they want it, And the tribal elder who kind of had the most influence over that district died in October of 2007 of a heart attack. And I knew that the district was going to come under attack immediately. And I went to the Canadian task force commander and I said, you're going to get an attack on Arghandab in the next couple of weeks. And he said, oh my God, I don't have the men. I don't have the men to move from over here to put them over there. If he had had the men, he could have blocked the attack. The attack came from north of the district. All you had to do was block it before it reached the district. Instead, what happened was the attack came, got into the district, and then had to get repelled. So it gets repelled with more damage to property, to people, and things like that. And I've been seeing this time and time again. So more troops really are necessary. It depends, what also I find really encouraging is the degree to which the U.S. Army has modified its approach to this kind of conflict based on the last couple of years of of realization, of thinking, of trying new techniques and saying, yeah, we do need to stop focusing so exclusively on the bad guys and start focusing more on the population. And so that's where I'd like to move to is how do we succeed? We can succeed. How do we do it? And how we do it is by understanding that you're only going to get the narrowest U.S. objective, which is eradicate bases for international terrorism, by doing a broad spectrum campaign that takes the needs of the population into account. Because, in fact, what we've been doing in Afghanistan since 2001 has been a narrow counterterrorism fight. Even though it might have been billed as something else in the very beginning, I watched our obsession with al-Qaeda lead us into really erroneous policies. Why did we empower these warlords and bring them back into Afghanistan and install them in governing positions? It wasn't because we were, sadistic and wanted to cause pain to the Afghan population. It's because we were so narrowly focused on al-Qaeda that anybody who said they would help us fight al-Qaeda, we empowered them. And we put them in, and then we didn't care how they governed because that didn't matter. What mattered was killing the bad guys. And so we didn't look at how these people governed their populations, and so we didn't notice as the population started drifting away toward the Taliban. So the result, that's one aspect. The other aspect is Pakistan. What Pakistan did, and I watched it, was basically, and by Pakistan I mean in particular the Pakistani military, and in more particular the Pakistani Military Intelligence Agency, but I do not mean rogue elements. This was a concerted policy on the part of the Pakistani military. And it was to buy us off with a well-timed delivery of an al-Qaeda operative about once every 2 or 3 months. And you can go back and look at the reporting. And what they bought for that was us turning a blind eye on the deliberate orchestration and reconstitution of the Taliban as a force for mischief in Afghanistan. And I was watching ISI agents running training camps. I was watching, and it's still the case, the Quetta Shura, the command and control structure of the Taliban operating in the Afghan South, is not hiding in some cave in some ungoverned place in Pakistan. It's in Quetta, which is the capital of Baluchistan province. And that province is really run by the ISI. I mean, I've worked there, and you can't move around that province without them knowing about it. So they know where the Quetta Shura is, and they are deliberately not taking it down. And there was a case when I had really, really clear evidence of how this strategy on the part of the Pakistani military was functioning, when I had, the famous actionable intelligence. I mean, I had a license plate number, and I had one of several safe houses of Mullah Baradar, who is a second-tier guy, one down from Mullah Omar, in Quetta. And I took it to the U.S. Embassy, and I was told, but there's nothing we can do about it. They just gave us Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. So those are two ways that our focus on a narrow counterterrorism strategy produced the opposite of its intended result. Because in 2001, we had a couple of mountaintops that were potential sanctuaries for international terrorism. Now we've got about 40% of the Afghan landmass, which is a potential sanctuary for international terrorists. And anyone who thinks that just because there aren't that many international terrorists currently living in Afghanistan, anyone who thinks that therefore we can leave things as they are or let them move further in that direction and not get international terrorism based in Afghanistan once again within 5 to 10 years is fooling himself or herself. So the first way to succeed is to understand, is to resist the siren call of can't we just do this on the cheap and just whack a couple of sanctuaries and be done with it, and either focus on Pakistan exclusively or get out of the whole region. We can't do that. We can't do that. The second way, I've resisted, as people over the past number of years have asked me to talk about Iraq, I've resisted doing it because what I've come to understand in Afghanistan is politics is local. And I feel pretty uncomfortable talking about eastern Afghanistan, let alone Iraq, right? I haven't lived in Iraq. I don't know the situation there. I don't want to talk about it. What I have started doing in the last couple of months is a lot of reading into what happened starting 2006 in Iraq to allow for a pretty dramatic paradigm shift. Because I think that's what we need in Afghanistan is a paradigm shift. The problem is that there's a temptation to say, wow, we did the paradigm shift in Iraq, therefore we can apply what we learned in Iraq to Afghanistan. Some of it we can. So the second point that I would like to make is a little bit of applying the Iraq formula. COIN, population-based campaign, protect the people. All of those aspects of COIN doctrine are really critical to the Afghan situation. And they have a lot I do see some military folks in the room, so excuse me if I go down a military rabbit hole here a little bit. But population-based campaign has a lot of ramifications. It means your intelligence assets need to be devoted to the population, not only to the enemy. It means you have to change your information requirements or requests to focus on things of import to the population, stuff like government abuse. Somebody asked me, what would a benchmark on government abuse be? And I said, well, one of them might be how many illegal checkpoints on the road between the Pakistani border and Kandahar. And the person said, oh my God, but how would we know? That's pretty elementary information to obtain if you devote some of your intelligence assets to it. We now have a major border control center that's a trilateral center at the Torkham Gate, which is on the Khyber Pass between Jalalabad and and Peshawar. Sorry. Somebody recently asked a very interesting question. Is this border control point only looking at the enemy? Is it looking at any other issues, like number of trucks that cross the border? Well, it is counting the trucks that cross the border. But it could also probably get a handle on there's predator feeds and stuff like that. You could probably get some of these illegal checkpoints. There's a lot of things that a border control point like that could be looking at. And so when I say a population-based campaign, I really mean it. That hasn't quite filtered all the way down. But for me, the most important paradigm shift goes back to this governance issue. And it's something that we just have not grappled with from 2001 until today. And I listened for years to officers and civilian officials telling me, first we're going to focus on security, and then when we establish security, then we can think about governance. And we're governance has started to move up the priority list. But it still isn't number one, which is where it should be, because I think that everything follows from governance. The only reason we've got anything that looks like an insurgency right now is, as I said, because of people's disaffection with governance. So, and development is not going to make a real difference if it's being passed through corrupt government channels. So let's talk about the election, for example, and let's talk about, the president's younger brother who is one of the most important officials in Kandahar province, the most important official. He's the president of the provincial council. He also has the governor under his thumb, because the previous governor who tried to contest him a little bit got immediately fired. That means that all development and humanitarian resources are passing through basically one person. Do you think that he is applying those resources as incentives to get people to vote for his brother, or threatening the withdrawal of those resources for anyone who might mount an opposition campaign against his brother? You better believe it. He's also supplying intelligence to, some of the military actors in the area. Do you think that he might threaten tribal elders that he could get their houses bombed? I've heard him do it. These are the ways that we're continuing to empower abusive officials. And until we start shifting that, we leave the Afghan population, who are, after all, the prize in a counterinsurgency campaign, no alternative but to turn to the Taliban for a way, if nothing else, to vent their frustrations. So why don't I leave it there and say that, well, let me just finish up and say that the Afghans around me were looking really forward to, the new government here, not for partisan reasons, not because they're Democrats as opposed to being Republicans. That's not the issue. The issue is they felt that a change in course was needed, that a change in policy was needed. And so it's like we recaptured the kind of suspension of disbelief that we were losing by the end of, 2008. We recaptured it, but it's going to burn out very, very quickly. And so I think that, yes, we absolutely can succeed. I think that if this starts to turn around, you'll see a virtuous circle start to build. People are desperate to believe in their government. They're desperate to believe that we really are there to help them. And so it's going to be relatively easy to convince them of that, but we need to convince them with deeds and not with words. Thank you very much, and let's turn this into a conversation.
Great. Thanks, Siren. That was great. How I'd like to proceed is to have you raise your hand, and then Evelina will bring a microphone around, and then please say who you are, and we'll go from there. This gentleman in the back, let's start with. Oh, you have a mic too, great.
Thank you very much. Tom Parker from the Defense Department. Wanted to ask your views about the public opinion polls that we see periodically. I think most of them showed that several years ago Karzai was quite popular, that now the favorability rating has gone down maybe to the high 40s. And the question I think that some people have about the accuracy of the polls are what applies, I guess, to any third world polling is, A, are people willing to tell the pollster what they really think, or are they afraid not to do so, either because of afraid of retaliation or just because of politeness or whatever. And then the second reservation would be, do the polling firms really, can they really monitor people who go out there? Can't monitors just make up data if it's, a rainy day or whatever? So I'm just curious about how accurate you think the polling is.
I think polling in Afghanistan is profoundly inaccurate for the reasons that you bring up, but let me go into them a little bit further. First of all, I do think they may have some value in tracking change. They have no value in terms of the absolute numbers. Mm-hmm. If you look at that poll, in other words, to look at a series of polls and say, wow, public support for President Karzai is falling, accurate. To say 40% of the Afghan population supports President Karzai, completely unreliable. And let me go into this a little bit. Number one is the reluctance to tell the truth. Afghans, I think it's really valuable to think of Afghans as suffering collective post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a country that has been through 30 years of combat. And start thinking about the symptoms that PTSD sufferers display And you will notice that they correspond to a lot of the things that people think are cultural norms for Afghans. They're not cultural norms. These folks are profoundly traumatized. And one of the first things that goes in PTSD sufferers is trust. Afghans habitually do not expose what they really think until they know what you think. And the way one Afghan friend of mine put it is, you want to let her unfold herself before you tell her what you think. And this is typically how Afghans, when I start conversing with an Afghan that I don't know, is they're very cagey and they try to figure out where I'm coming from. So that's, even if you're not a pollster, that's how most Afghans interact with you. And the reason for that is that they've been through so many sea changes politically where you weren't just a party out of power. You could get killed if you had expressed a contrary opinion, So it's a survival technique. Secondly, when we think about neutral polling agencies, we think of, let's say Republicans and Democrats, and a polling agency can be neutral, bipartisan, or apolitical in that construct. Whereas in Afghanistan, going to school is already a non-neutral act. Therefore, taking a poll is already a non-neutral act. It places you on one side or another. That means answering a pollster is a non-neutral act, because you've already placed yourself on the side of the government. Or you subject yourself to the possibility of retaliation if you're in a Taliban affected or controlled area. So that means that you're going to skew your sample dramatically in favor of those who are already in favor of the government or who feel free to speak out that way. Now, to some extent, this is being... Then your second issue is, do people actually get out into the countryside and stuff like that? Well, I've watched polling forms being filled out in an office. So that does happen a lot. I think it's being somewhat improved by telephone polling. The other thing is that it's too dangerous for anyone connected to, a pollster who is already a non-neutral person cannot go out into a lot of these districts safely. I mean, if they're confiscating telephones, do you think they're not confiscating polling forms? That is being somewhat counteracted by telephone polls. But I think that Afghanistan, polling is always a unreliable art. I would say Afghanistan is one of the environments least permissive to polling that I've encountered.
Great. This gentleman here.
I think this young man also was one of the first with his hands up.
Yeah, no, I'm coming next to him, and then I'm going to work.
Okay.
We'll get everybody.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Wade Channel from USAID. I was out in Afghanistan a couple of years ago looking at legal reform issues, and it was my impression that little meaningful input was either sought or obtained from Afghans in the legal reform process and the drafting of new laws. That I won't say Afghans were irrelevant to the process, but it seemed pretty close to that. One, is this your experience? And two, in the new age of, we're talking a lot about smart power now. Would you suggest a smarter way?
I think in general, one of the real drawbacks of a lot of the technical assistance that was provided to the Afghan government was that it was very highly overpaid, and it would basically be experts from the outside with little interaction with Afghans writing documents. It was basically an assessment rather than mentoring, which could have really done some good. It was an assessment which was deposited in the ministry and gathered dust, essentially. I'd like to break down your, I think we have a little bit of a problem when we talk about the Afghans. I'd like to reiterate the distinction between the Afghan government and the Afghan population. So I would like to see a lot more consultation with the Afghan population when we're talking about reforms of various types, and maybe a little bit less consultation with the Afghan government, particularly insofar as rule of law and anti-corruption measures are concerned. Because quite frankly, asking the Afghan government to clean this up is asking Al Capone to take down the mafia. It's not, that's not necessarily who you want to be interacting with, but or be getting your advice from. On the other hand, the Afghan population is incredibly shrewd, savvy, wise about a lot of these things. I had at my cooperative, I had a women's constitutional law working group. And this was during the period the Constitution was being drafted. And it was a small group, but we ranged from school principals to illiterate women. I very much wanted to have, a cross-section. And, it was amazing. We had, there was a kind of preamble question about what do you want your Constitution to do for you? And they sort of came up with liberty, equality, and human rights or something like that. And so I started trying to break that down. Okay, equality, what do you mean by equality? Because under Sharia, there are some real limitations to equality. And interestingly, the most educated women, when you waved the Sharia red flag at them, said, oh my God, we have to do whatever Sharia says. I modify my desire for equality according to whatever Sharia says. And one of the illiterate women thought about it, and then she said, you know what? It hurts just as much to give birth to a girl as to give birth to a boy. So I think there should be absolute equality. And what they came out with was equal representation for women in government. So they designed a bicameral legislature with, in the Senate, 2 women and 2 men from every province, for example. Now, I don't think, we're years away from gender equality in Parliament. They had a device for judges. How should judges be selected? They said there should be an exam for judges, and the examination results should be posted so the population knows whether or not people got in by nepotism anyway, or by cronyism anyway. They wanted a national service, because they said one of the best ways to break down ethnic rivalries and tribalism and stuff like that is put all of our young men, we want mandatory national service. We don't want a volunteer army. We want mandatory national service. So they all have to, get in there together, and then the officer candidates should be chosen from among these young men in national service. How they perform should. So the Afghan population, I think, is way ahead of its leadership on a lot of these things. On rule of law, I find, on rule of law, one of the things they're very interested in is maintain the traditional system, which we're moving in that direction in the United States toward alternate dispute resolutions. Well, they find that the traditional system functions very effectively for a lot of disputes. Use the formal legal system as a kind of appeal or an option. If you opt, you can opt out of the traditional system, but you should be able to opt into it. Things like that I found very interesting. I think mentoring, on the other hand, has been one of the most successful programs that the international community has mounted in Afghanistan with the Army. And I find it really interesting to discover that somehow it didn't trouble anyone that an Afghan National Army officer might need international mentoring to become a good Army officer. And yet it never dawned on anyone that a mayor or a governor or a provincial director of public health could use some mentoring to do his job. And so one of the things I really hope comes out of the quote-unquote dramatic increase, I've got some of these lines out of the strategy speech memorized, right? Dramatic increase in civilian effort. This is really important, and I hope that the response to the notion of a dramatic increase in civilian effort doesn't get too narrowly focused on conventional program-oriented or development-oriented technical expertise. We need all of that. We need a lot of that. But what we need is, frankly, some retired mayors, some retired governors, some retired, power company chiefs to come in and mentor their Afghan counterparts, carefully selected, rigorously trained. That's really important, and it's another leaf to take out of the military book. There isn't a single battalion commander who deploys to Afghanistan who hasn't been through a year of training. I find it amusing that civilians think they can walk out of the United States and somehow give a lot of great advice about rule of law. Long answer to your question.
This gentleman, and then we're going to go to Kareem and Federica, too.
Thank you.
Said Zafar Hashmi from Voice of America. 2 questions I had for you.
One, you get one. I'm a former journalist.
Okay.
There's a lot of other people waiting.
Okay, so,
choose your favorite one.
It's hard. Tell us about, is it possible to hold or to have or to witness a fair, free, and democratic and well-participated election in Afghanistan based on the situation that you see in the ground?
That's the cue for my show and tell. These are voter registration cards. I purchased them.
I was going to say, how much do you want for them? Right?
I purchased them. I could have bought 1,000. Overnight, I could have bought 1,000. We are talking a lot about the credibility, about freedom and fairness of this election. But as your question suggests, there are already significant violations of electoral law happening in broad daylight. This is one of them. I could run for office in Kandahar province if I wanted to, because I could buy sufficient voter registration cards. All I'd need to do is get my citizenship, but I'm sure I could buy that too. You've got, as I said, there's a concentration of incentives and disincentives in the hands of certain people who hold government office and have been placed in certain provinces deliberately by President Karzai in order to secure those provinces. And they're very open about it. Talk to the governor of Ghazni about why he got appointed to be the governor of Ghazni. He's open about it. He says, I'm here to help President Karzai get elected. Well, in a free and fair system, that might not sound as outrageous as it sounds in Afghanistan, because what the person would be meaning is, I'm here to campaign for President Karzai or something like that. When you're in a situation where you control, as I say, development assets, humanitarian assets, and interaction with military forces, saying that I'm here to help President Karzai get elected takes on a somewhat more ominous cast. The governor of Ghazni told me in Pashto, in the office of the then American battalion commander last summer, that not only was he there to help President Karzai get elected, but that he would have to do some secret things to help President Karzai get elected. That's even more ominous. And what he said was, I can share those with my American brother, meaning the American battalion commander. Meaning that his assumption was that the United States was so in favor of President Karzai being reelected that an American officer would not mind or would collude with, quote, secret things being done to get President Karzai elected. That is not the case. That is not the position of the United States government. That is not the position of ISAF. However, what I do think is necessary is for that commitment to a credible election to be translated from words into deeds. And there are a lot of ways for that to happen. One is that there needs to be more widespread collecting of information on the types of abuses that are going on. I mean, this took me exactly one day to have happen. There are a lot of military and civilian assets in the field who interact with the ordinary population on a day-to-day basis. And I think that they could very usefully be asked to ask some questions about electoral abuses and report on those abuses, both up their own chains and across to, for example, the Electoral Complaints Commission, which does have sanctioning authority and which does have some very professional, both international and Afghan members. I mean, this is not a pushover commission. I think that when there are examples of electoral abuses that are pretty well substantiated, there needs to be some consequences for officials who indulge in them. And that means that maybe they don't get that CERP project that they were just offered, or it's going to get held up until after the election. Or, in other words, I think that we have to be a little bit less mechanical in our support for government officials when they are caught in participating in electoral fraud. Whether even that kind of action could fully level the playing field, I'm not entirely sure. But it at least would demonstrate to the Afghan population that we mean it when we say free and fair, that it's not just rhetoric. Because for the moment, securing an election when these kinds of violations are underway signals to the Afghan population that we are complicit with them. And it's something that I really think we need to get serious about very quickly.
Thanks. Kareem and then Federico. We'll take two, just so we can get them.
could answer his second question, because I want 2 questions to about this.
Well, if everybody's good, we can come back around.
That's right.
But first, I wanted to thank you for a wonderful presentation, very, very insightful.
Tell everybody who doesn't know who you are, and maybe a couple of them.
Sure. I'm Karim Sajidpour here with the Carnegie Endowment. I'm an associate. George is my boss. So,
Sure.
And I wanted to ask you, I'm not sure if you had a chance to see the reports which were published by Carnegie, which George introduced at the beginning, but one is from Ashley Tellison and others from Frederick, and I think they offer somewhat opposite policy prescriptions in the sense that Gilles' argument is that the mere presence of foreign troops in Afghanistan brings rise to the Taliban, and therefore we should essentially pull out foreign troops. I don't know if you would, that's more or less what he says. And then, Ashley would argue that we need initially a military campaign against the Taliban. Neither of them are arguing for purely military campaign, but they reach kind of opposite conclusions. I wanted to know if you had any thoughts on this. And going back to the Iraq analogy of 2006, when you talk to people like General Petraeus and others, they will tell you in private that financially co-opting these SOIs, the Sons of Iraq, was instrumental in this paradigm shift, as you mentioned.
That sounds like a second question, doesn't it?
No, it's related to this. Related to the first. I will tell you why it's related, because it's going to the Taliban, and whether or not you think they could be financially co-opted.
Hold on, sir, 1 second. Federica, do you have is your question at all like this one, or should we?
Yeah,
all right,
yeah,
go ahead,
let me
go
take
ahead,
these,
go ahead,
because
go
these
ahead.
are both,
Yeah,
and as you've noticed, I'm the long answer kind of gal. Like, I can't do the multiple choice questions. I'm not too good at. And actually, before I launch into this, I would like to reiterate that everything that I have said thus far is my own personal opinion gleaned from the environment that I described to you. Do not take any of the statements that I just made as ISAF policy in any way, shape, or form. Part of the reason that I've been brought on board is to challenge some of the, some of the thinking in headquarters. And so, as General McKiernan said to a group of opinion makers when he said that he was off the record, I had forgotten to tell them, I had met them previously and forgotten to tell them it was off the record. So I said, me too, I was off the record. And he said, oh my God, Sarah is absolutely off the record. So just bear that in mind. And it's in that framework that I feel that I have reign to speak as freely as I have. So, the first question was about these 2 different approaches. I very strongly subscribe to Ashley Tellis's approach. I mean, I haven't read his report start to finish, but I've read, the kind of extract from it. And I wrote him actually saying, let me subscribe to or second pretty much everything that you have to say here. And I think that Gilles is really dead wrong, and I've got, again, personal experience to account for it. There was no rejection to the international military presence throughout 2002, throughout most of 2003. In fact, I think the Afghan population has been remarkably patient with the international presence. And as I said, I experienced no rejection on the basis of my being a meddling international with a big mouth. I mean, I just don't think the evidence is there that there is an intrinsic rejection of international presence in Afghanistan. On the contrary, it was seen as the winch that could maybe drag Afghanistan up out of its 30-year nightmare. And the only reason Afghans have started to turn against it is because they're suffering, practically, because of not the best policies and frankly, because of the negative second and third order effects of a narrow counterterrorism policy. Buying off Taliban foot soldiers, I don't see it working. Yeah, sure, if you offer people employment, it competes with employment with the Taliban, but not everyone is joining up as a foot soldier because of unemployment. You've got to address the problem of being governed by a repudiated, disrespectful predatory government. If you don't, and that's where I see the Vietnam parallel, is no military force in the world can durably prop up a government that is fundamentally repudiated by its citizenry. But what I would say is that Afghans are not gravitating toward the Taliban out of a because these are who they want to come back in. It's really a protest vote. So that's what you have to address, and that's how you win over the foot soldiers. I don't think that you can buy off Afghans. Afghans will take your money, and they'll do what they want.
But Gilles would agree, just to jump in, Gilles would agree with most of that, and I think one of his central arguments is in the areas where the Taliban now have control, and the idea would be to expand the military presence, although he'd argue we're never going to have enough troops to do it right in lots of areas. But the idea is to go into an area, take over, and hand it over to the Afghan state. He says there are no instruments of the state in those areas. So his question is, even if you took those areas and had enough concentration of force to take them,
Disagree.
To whom do you hand
Disagree.
them over?
Jari and Panjwai district that are owned by the Taliban are within 10 miles of Kandahar city. Mm-hmm. But you have to turn it over to respectful instruments of the state.
That's his question
there.
is, okay.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is we're talking 10 miles outside of Kandahar city. You've got, as a matter of fact, Jari and Panjwai district have a district chief. They've got a district chief of police. And even so, the Taliban own the district. So that doesn't really fit his model, you see, which implies that the Taliban move into a vacuum. That's not an accurate depiction of what I'm experiencing in the South. Khakrez district belongs to the Taliban, has a district chief and a district shura. So I'm wondering how much time he spent there and or in what areas he spent his time. Because there might be areas in the East where you've got this kind of vacuum of governance. But you've got very heavily Taliban-controlled areas in the South, simultaneous with government structures being there. And the problem is that the government structures do not meet the people's needs.
Mm-hmm. Federica.
To continue, Federica Bindi, neighbor, Brookings Institution. Do you think that dividing good Talibani from bad Talibani and talk to the good ones would be a strategy? And secondly, very quickly, what would be your proposal to eradicate crop?
Poppy.
Yeah.
That sounds like two questions, too. How did I get bamboozled into this? I'll take your first one. I'd like to go around and make sure nobody else has a first question before I take your second one. So on the first question, I don't understand the good Taliban, bad Taliban thing. What I do understand is that I wouldn't talk about reconciliation, and I wouldn't talk about splitting off the reconcilables from the irreconcilables for a number of reasons. Number one is that I don't see this as an issue of moderate and extreme. Again, this is not an ideological conflict. So what we're really talking about, the way I would describe it, is foot soldiers. Can you flip the foot soldiers or win over the foot soldiers? And I think you can do that, but you do it by creating, once again, the conditions that they can bear to live under. I would submit that many of us would be tempted to join the Taliban if we had to live under this current Afghan government. I mean, to me, the fact that the Afghans are rejecting this government is actually a sign of their democracy, not a sign of their unwillingness to accept democracy. It's just that the only alternative out there is really the Taliban. And so what you need to do is create conditions that make it tolerable for people to live under the government. And that means, first of all, improving governance. I don't want to belabor that yet further, but I will. And then, secondly, once you get a reasonably respectful and responsive government structure in place, then you can start to work development and economic development. Because quite frankly, I'm trying to run a business in Kandahar. Let me tell you what a nightmare it is. Let me tell you what it's like trying to bring in first of all, we got no electricity. Second of all, we got the Canadians to pay for a solar electric system. Let me tell you what it was like trying to bring that equipment in across the border. How many bribes we had to pay, right? The customs regime is skewed against manufacturing inside Afghanistan. It is more expensive. You have a higher tariff bringing in raw materials than bringing in manufactured goods. Customs in general are not going to the government coffers. I mean, all of this stuff, you cannot do economic development without getting governance back on the rails. It's a waste of money. And so that, to me, is how you win over the foot soldiers. Now, let's talk about this notion of reconciliation. I think it's been a very dangerous and counterproductive conversation to have, because we may think that we mean, I mean, when you read the fine print when General Petraeus talks about reconciliation, what I think he thinks he means is winning over the foot soldiers. But he uses the word reconciliation, and what Afghans hear is dealing power for peace. And here are two things that happen. The Tajiks, they've been dealt, you know, this is classic in the last 30 years, is people exchanging power for peace and people doing deals, right? And so here's the first thing that happens when Afghans hear about reconciliation. The Tajiks start arming up. Believe me, there are weapons caches that are starting to get built up in the northern part of the country. And the Pashtuns line up with the Taliban, not because they like them, but because they say, oh my God, if the Americans are going to deal us away, they're going to deal the South. They're going to deal governorships in the South and the East, and they'll deal a couple of ministries. And so we better line up with the new guys in town. And I have experienced this literally with people who wanted to join our cooperative. And then starting last October, when this reconciliation talk started to get big, it was like, not anymore, because it's going to go the other way. The Americans are going to deal us away. Secondly, I would submit that when you have my former boss, Qayyum Karzai, spending a lot of time in Saudi Arabia meeting allegedly with Taliban officials, or certainly saying that that's what he's doing, and claiming the backing of the President of the United States, which is what he did to the New York Times. He said, oh, it was very useful to us when President Obama talked about reconciliation, because that's what I'm doing in Saudi Arabia. That is not foot soldiers. You are not winning over any foot soldiers in Saudi Arabia. So let's us, once again, get our story straight. What is it that we're talking about when we talk about reconciliation? Are we really talking about splitting the reconcilables or the foot soldiers and reintegrating them into the Afghan population? If that's what we're talking about, I'm all for it. I really am. Because those guys, they're village kids, and they may have been misguided. I mean, I don't approve of anyone using terror tactics, and some of them are unexcusable and unforgivable. But the vast bulk of the guys who are earning a couple of $100s a month being Taliban foot soldiers are villagers who are quite legitimately outraged at the way their government is treating them, or the way we have treated them, or who don't have other forms of employment and things like that. And I'm all for reintegrating them in a constructive way into the Afghan society, assuming repudiation of violence, and especially certain forms of violence. But that's not what's going on in Saudi Arabia. And if what we're really talking about when we talk about reconciliation is some kind of dealing power for peace, and if we think, I want to go back to what I said before, if we think that in Afghanistan, partly or wholly given back over to the Taliban is not going to convert back into a sanctuary for terrorists in short order, we're fooling ourselves. So I don't think that is a constructive avenue out of this, because I don't think it solves the population's problem. Giving the population over to yet a different form of abusive governance doesn't solve their problem. Their problem is with abusive governance, and I don't see how Taliban coming back to power solves it. There was one there.
This lady here, and then the gentleman with the beard right behind her, and then this gentleman here, and then we'll work our way back around. These two ladies. I've got to remember.
He's got the biggest job. I have one question, and it's about development. You've talked about your integrated development. We know about the issues of foreign aid coming in with huge amounts of money and not much of it getting there. And then when it gets there, it's used how? Is it really building mansions in America?
Yeah.
And what about the PRT? And how does that work?
Yeah. I have a hard time answering the second part of that question, because PRTs are national assets, and I live in Kandahar where the PRT is a Canadian national asset. Every PRT operates differently because there's no coherent ISAF command and control over the PRTs. And so every nation directs its PRT to function how that nation wants it to function. So in fact, what you get is a very balkanized picture on the PRT. So I actually can't answer your question. But on development, once again, when you're, typical development procedure is a contract is put out. It is subcontracted several times before you get to the guy who's actually implementing the project. What that means is a lot of money goes to mansions, and it means that a lot of shoddy workmanship is done. And I'm at a loss to understand why we weren't monitoring this stuff. I do not understand why that became standard operating procedure. I went out into the bazaar in Urgun, in Paktika, which is far east. And I just started, because I actually wanted to test a hypothesis that I've heard out there that, okay, Sarah, you live in the South where people do care about governance, but in the East, they're really much more tribal and they want autonomy and they don't want to be governed. And so what I got was people's number one complaint was, why is the mayor misusing the SERP project? He had a SERP, a Commander's Emergency Fund project, to do street repairs and street cleaning in this little town center. And what he did was give the money to one of his cronies who never did the work. And the people were up in arms, and they were up in arms at us because they said, why are you not better monitoring the expenditure of your money? So I actually think we don't need a massive influx of extra resources. I think we need to better monitor the resources we are expending and use them once again to bring about improvements in governance. It's a two-way street. When you get better governance, you get better expenditure of development dollars. When you start monitoring your development dollars better, you get better governance because you're actually, cracking down on people a little bit.
Great. This gentleman here with the beard.
Hi, my name is Adi Gharib. I'm with Interpress Service. You said that you viewed troops as necessary to the process, and I'm just wondering, this sort of goes in line with the development question as well. Are there any, when the Afghan MP, whose name escapes me at the moment, asked why can't the U.S. send 30,000 engineers and teachers instead of troops, it really got laughed off in this town. I'm wondering if you think that there are sort of large-scale manpower things that are not military related that you view as absolutely necessary to the process of recovery.
Absolutely. For example, and here I can speak quite specifically to this, the State Department, in response to, or maybe in preparation for, what they knew would be some kind of discussion of increased civilian effort by President Obama, came up with a list of 270 people that it thought were needed in Afghanistan. 21,000 troops when you include the training brigade, and 270 civilians, and I was just absolutely gobsmacked. And one of the things that I've been, speaking out in favor of, as I did a little while ago, the first answer to your question is mentors for Afghan government officials. We've got terrific mentoring going on in the Afghan National Army. It has turned the Army around in 2 years. I watched the Afghan National Army deployed at Kandahar. It was a disaster. They were beating people. They were stealing things from shops. They had to be kicked out of the city, basically. And what turned them around was embedded mentoring. What turned my cooperative around is embedded mentoring. I'm now comfortable sitting here talking to you guys today, knowing that my cooperative is functioning because I did embedded mentoring for 2.5 or 3 years. Not, again, because I'm wonderful, but just because, again, and not because Afghans are stupid or lazy or whatever. They are deconstructed by 30 years of combat. You're in 30 years of combat. When you're in combat, you don't necessarily grab a hammer when you need to pound in a nail. If you've got a rock handy and you don't have a hammer handy, you take the rock and pound in your nail with a rock. Well, those are habits that take some time and mentoring to undo. So what I would, and I did a kind of, and it was very hasty, and I did it with the Deputy Chief of Staff for Stabilization, who is a Dutch 2-star general, and his whole team. We did a hasty, back-of-the-envelope estimate of what kind of resources would be needed to mentor both at the ministry and the provincial level. And we looked at those ministries that don't already have heavy mentoring, and some of them do, like the Ministry for Rural Rehabilitation and Development, and guess what? It's one of the most professional ministries. Finance Ministry has had some heavy mentoring and stuff like that, but there are other ministries that have been underserved in this regard and are actually asking for it because they've seen the benefits to some of the other ministries. So we went through and making some phone calls and stuff like that, kind of came up with a roster for the ministries. Then we went through the provinces, and we didn't have time in that time frame, which was we basically had a week to turn this around. And what we've suggested is there be an assessment mission. And I'm not in general in favor of assessment missions, but there's such a hodgepodge of capacity building going on right now that you really do need an assessment mission to go out and figure out who all is there. USAID is doing some. The Canadian International Development Agency is doing some. The Indian government is doing a lot. We don't quite know who's doing what where. But different provinces are going to need different mentoring assets. But we came up with about 2,100, roughly. If you put that on top of, because we only focused on mentoring, put that on top of the State Department, which has now expanded its request for much more traditional project and program-oriented technical expertise, which is also needed, and some consular officials. I think they're up in the 400 range. I think you're looking at probably 3,000. Now, let me make very clear what I mean when I say 3,000. I don't mean 3,000 U.S. government employees. There are a lot of drawbacks to having it be U.S. government employees. One is we don't have enough of them. Two is, we need some of them. I'd love to see more USDA folks. I'd like to see more FBI folks. I'd like to see more Department of Justice folks doing, in some cases, some of these mentoring roles. But there are some severe security constraints placed on U.S. government employees. Now, I live on one end of the scale in terms of how you can operate in Afghanistan. I operate more or less like an Afghan. I don't have any security detail or restrictions whatsoever. I take my own precautions, but I don't have any government-imposed security restrictions. Deputy Secretary of State Liu, when he recently visited Afghanistan, was horrified by the security restrictions he was placed under, and it actually colored his understanding of what civilians can do there, because his feeling was there's either me or how Sarah operates. There's nobody in between. Whereas there are lots of models for where you can fall in between, including the way the UN operates, which is subject to quite serious and professional security restrictions, but they can function in all of the provincial capitals. They could do all of these mentoring roles at least at the provincial level. They have a very professional security organization with rules that everyone is taught and stuff like that. There are serious private contractors out there that operate in a much more flexible fashion than U.S. government employees. So that's one issue with a second issue with U.S. government employees. What I would love to see for a mentoring mission would be a kind of parallel structure to what CSTICA is, the military Afghan National Security Force mentoring command, which is a military command. I would like to see a kind of civilian mentoring mission in Afghanistan, which would be run by civilians. It would be a unified multinational command. This is the ideal place to attract our allies, right? It's not going to get them in trouble with their public opinion for doing more combat missions. And what Europeans really know how to do well is run cities and run health departments and run, the French have an incredible water resource management system based around watersheds that I haven't seen replicated here anyway. I would love to see, again, we need a little bit of inspiration. We need to stop saying who would go, who would do it, oh, no one would do it, you couldn't get anyone to do that. Shooting the breeze about this, I've already got my first candidate who is a retiring U.S. attorney for the eastern half of the state of Kansas. She would be a phenomenal mentor for a provincial public prosecutor, for example. And I submit that with a little bit of an inspiring pitch, I think I could get, maybe not 2,000, but I think I could get a couple of hundred within a month or so. And let's say we reach out to our allies with the same kind of pitch. I bet you could get 20 each from 10 allies. That gets us another 200, right? We're way above the State Department ask in that sort of way. Unfortunately, I'm not hearing this kind of an inspiring pitch. I think if President Obama got up there and said, send us your retired mayors, send us your, you know what I mean? I think he could get a lot.
That was inspiring. Gentleman here. And then we're going to come back over.
Thank you. My name is Jerry Hyman. I'm at the Center for Strategic and International Studies with the Hills Program on Governance. And I'm afraid you'll be sorry to hear that I just came back on an assessment on governance, but happy to hear that the core of it is that we have a corrupt, predatory, kleptocratic governance system. But the question really, I wonder if I could ask you, since you're at ISAF, about the drones, because they tend to be a dividing point or debating point here. Is this debate about the drones overwrought? How important are they to Afghans? Is this really a serious problem? What about the alternatives? They're there for a purpose. What would the alternative be to them? They tend to get center stage and push out things like governance quite a bit in the debate.
Interesting. I'm a little out of my depth here because I don't really know anything about the tactical. So I can't speak from an ISAF perspective at all. I can certainly speak from an Afghan population perspective, which is it is enormously popular with the Afghan population. As a matter of fact, if President Karzai really wanted to win the election, what he would do is declare war against Pakistan. He would win the election hands down if he did that, and we would lose all of our manpower because every Afghan male under the age of 70 and above the age of about 10, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not a lot, would take up arms against Pakistan. So the drones are very popular with Afghans. I think they're less popular with Pakistanis. I can't really speak to... Although, I mean, I don't know how much less popular in that, I mean, civilian casualties wherever they take place are wrong, are counterproductive, and I can go on with a lot more adjectives and expletives and stuff like that. However, let's go back to the Quetta Shura. The Pakistani military has in its hands the possibility of taking down this thing. This whole thing that's going on in Afghanistan. And so I think that what you see in the drone program is a sort of, you guys can do this pretty easily, and you're not doing it. So you're leaving us no choice. And I'm really speaking for myself there. I'm not at all speaking for ISAF. But I really wonder what it is that we're supposed to do when this thing is being generated from across the border. And across the border is unwilling to grapple with it in any serious way, particularly grapple with what's happening in Afghanistan. And so I don't think it is as big a deal, and it's certainly not as big a deal in Afghanistan as it is here. It really isn't an issue that gets raised in Afghanistan, except applause.
Okay, hold on. Yeah, I don't want to forget the people who had their hands up earlier. Yeah, go ahead.
Agnieszka Paczyńska from George Mason University. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little more about how to get good governance established.
Yeah.
Because I can see sort of small-scale efforts and mentoring and so forth, but how do you dislodge what is this incredibly corrupt and predatory government structure?
Well, I don't think mentoring is a small-scale program. I think if you seriously put 3,000 mentors throughout, and you couldn't roll it out all at once, you'd have to do pilot programs. If I were doing it, I would actually, if I were a combination of Ambassador Eikenberry and General McKiernan, I would, because I think it takes a combination, even on governance. You can't exclude the military from the governance issue because Afghans listen to the military because they've got the biggest footprint. So battalion commanders are not exempt from governance duty. I would focus on a pilot province. And I would make that pilot province one of the border provinces. It would be either Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-i-Sharif, or Jalalabad. And the reason for that is that those are the provinces with the big customs houses. So I would start my governance efforts with customs because Kandahar itself should be bringing in, 2003, according to a UN estimate, should have been bringing in $5 to $8 million a month in customs. Gulagha Shirzai in Jalalabad province, or folks who are in Jalalabad, estimate roughly that he is keeping 90% of customs revenues. That's multi-million dollars. The government's salaries, I mean, the first thing you have to do if you want to take corruption seriously is give people a living wage. Right. I cannot pay my cooperative members who are semi-skilled folks, semi-educated, semi to mid-skilled folks. I cannot pay them less than $250 a month. A police officer's salary, I think we're up to about $150. The price of a sack of flour is $60. $50. A family eats 2 of those, 1.5 to 2 a month. So on a salary of $150, you're having half of it taken up by just flour. All right? So $5 million a month turns over a lot of $250 salaries. You can immediately double the salaries. So what I would do is get a grip on customs, double the salaries of all government officials, triple the salaries of teachers off the bat. Now, that's not going to end corruption, but it does end the rationale for corruption. Then what I would do is have this mentoring. And the other thing I would do is establish some kind of a joint resolution or redress of grievances mechanism. This is not meant to be a new bureaucratic structure that is added to all the other bureaucratic structures. But the fact is, rule of law takes a very long time to build. Training judges, protecting judges, training lawyers, and stuff like that. You are not going to turn over corruption cases within this decade of serious corrupt officials. It is a pipe dream. So you need to buy the decade that your folks need in order to establish some rule of law institutions. You need to buy some time. And the way to buy time, I believe, is to set up, and here's, I think the design of this commission would have to be different in different provinces, but let's take a kind of model, which would include, on the Afghan side, public prosecutor, if you can find an uncorrupt one, a regional member of the High Office of Oversight, which is a recently created kind of redress of grievances, or it's an oversight mechanism in the government. A member of provincial council, because the provincial, at least the National Assembly, has also a complaints committee, which is similar to this. And then I'd put at least 3 non-governmental Afghans of stature and courage on this committee. On the international side, I would put a member of the maneuver element. I would put somebody from the PRT. I would put the senior civilian. I'd put the USAID or lead nation development agency. And I'd have a law enforcement professional, an FBI agent or some kind of law enforcement professional. I would give this committee 6 cops, Afghan cops, who would be under the tutelage of this law enforcement professional. Again, the objective is not to produce a federal case. The objective is to establish that complaints that are brought are well-grounded enough to follow up. And then what this committee should do is collect grievances, prioritize them. You don't do, one guy has, the one that I brought to a previous governor of Afghanistan affected all of the manufacturers who were trying to build factories in Kandahar province, right? That's the kind of grievance you want to take up. And you then vet it using your police resources. And then you send it up both chains simultaneously. In other words, it goes to the High Office of Oversight. Let them work their stuff. But meanwhile, your battalion commander or task force commander in Kandahar, he's a 1-star general. He's not a lieutenant colonel. You have him and the senior civilian start taking these concrete grievances to the governor and say, you know what, Mr. Governor, and this is what I did with the governor of Kandahar over, they were not selling land in the industrial zone to factory owners. They were trying to make the factory owners build their factories and then sell the land, which means that they can ask whatever price they want for the land if the guy's already built this factory. And I said, Mr. Governor, you've got to focus on this issue and give land title to these guys. And he says, I don't want to talk about it. I said, you have to. You're the governor. And I did this jokingly. It's one of the things you can get away with as a female. You're not, it's not a loss of face because I'm a girl and I can kind of laugh and stuff like that. And I actually took his calendar off of his desk and I said, oh, you're free tomorrow at 11 o'clock. I'm coming with the manufacturers. And I wrote myself in, and we came the next day. And then I backed out of the process, but I kept coming back in when it would stall out. Well, if I had been a battalion commander, that thing would have been solved in a month instead of in 15 months. And so that's one of the things that I would do to start to kind of put the screws in these public officials for better behavior. And the fact is, we've never asked them for it. And when we ask them for stuff, they provide it. We asked Gullah Shirzai for a poppy-free province. Bang. We got a poppy-free province the next month, the next year. When we focus on issues, they deliver. Because the fact is that they owe their positions to us. If we pull out tomorrow, these guys are dead or back in exile by sunset, basically.
There's this gentleman back here, and then let's take two because we're running out of time. So this gentleman and this gentleman will work our way back along the backside.
Hi, I'm James Kitfield from National Journal Magazine. I'm curious whether the timing of this, you talked about this summer as being a time of some urgency. The military, when I talk to them, thinks that 2010 will be decisive in the
2009, campaign. I think they say.
No, they're saying 2010.
What military is saying 2010?
The guys you're working with, some of those guys are sending the message that the troops won't be in place until this fall, and that then you'll have your winter season, and then next spring is when they think
that's
decisive.
A little bit different. Let me make a distinction there and say I think everyone I work with is saying that 2009 is the make or break year. What they are asking you folks, and I think they're right, is don't start counting against benchmarks until 2010.
Okay.
That's slightly different.
Well, that's basically my question. Is the way this thing is lined up in terms of how much political capital, there's a lot of people who think that, we're kind of war weary at this point with Afghanistan. Do you see us winning Afghanistan, as your question was posed, in the time frame that's realistic for this administration to actually focus this kind of effort on it?
I think we have to, because before the U.S. population gets war-weary, the Afghan population is going to get war-weary. What I'm worried about, I'm embedded in the Afghan population. We are going to lose the population by the end of this summer if we don't start making the kind of changes that I'm talking about. And if we lose the Afghan population, there's nothing we can do. I mean, it doesn't matter how many resources we throw at it. So I am even more concerned in terms of time frame than those people who are watching the U.S. population. On the other hand, I don't think it's realistic to start, as I say, testing us at ISAF against benchmarks until, first of all, we have our additional resources. And I don't think it's realistic to imagine us being out of Afghanistan fully and thoroughly by, 2 or 3 years from now. I don't think that's realistic. On the other hand, I think that if we start turning things around this summer, as I said before, you're going to get a virtuous circle going, and it's going to get really exciting. You're going to see what that place looks like when the Afghans are pulling together. It's an incredible population. And so that, I think, is going to re-stimulate all of us to throw ourselves back into the thing. And that's going to buy us more time, if you see what I mean, with the American public and in turn with the Afghan population.
This gentleman.
David King from the National Defense University. In respect to the upcoming elections, I was wondering if you see a credible alternative to President Karzai emerging, and whether you think that the next government realistically can be more reformist and less corrupt than the one we have at the moment.
I don't like to play the main name game on elections. I think there are a number of credible, realistic, perfectly acceptable alternatives to President Karzai. I want to go back to process, because I think how we handle the process answers both of your questions. If we start getting, and that was the gentleman from, I think he was from VOA, his question, if we get serious about the process and start demanding better performance on free and fair, you get two results from that. You make it more likely that an alternative candidate might possibly win. And secondly, you make it more likely that whoever is elected, including President Karzai, or whoever takes the election, I don't really want to say elected, including President Karzai, will be more reformist, not because he wants to be out of the goodness of his heart, but because there there are structures in place to oblige it. And because he actually believes that, we are serious about a new compact with the Afghan government to crack down on corrupt behavior. I don't think you can expect any individual in and of himself in this context to behave less corruptly. We've got to start demanding it.
This lady here, and then the gentleman back. Let's try
let's
to take
do
two.
1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're done.
Right. No, exactly. Right. But I think we ought to do them maybe in pairs, or you want to try all four?
No, let's just do them one by one.
All right.
Yeah.
You're a brave woman.
I'll be quick.
But we knew that. Go ahead.
Kathy Silverstein, Enterprise Resource Group. No discussion of Afghanistan would be complete without a discussion of the status of women. I'd like to just have your thoughts about the new Shiite law about women's rights, where they are required to be at home except for any reasonable reason to be outside of the home, and the law that effectively sanctions family rape, and that apparently Karzai has signed and has raised an outcry, including women's protests in the streets. So what is the status of that? How does that reflect the future? Is it an indication that things are going in the wrong direction? Just wanted to have your comment about that.
Got it. Yes, things are going in the wrong direction, no question about it. I am watching families, as they get more and more concerned about security, get more and more restrictive about what they want their girls to do, how their wives function in society and stuff like that. The law really is a, what's the word I'm looking for, is a articulation of reality. Everything that is in that law is how Afghan women live. And anyone who thinks that's not the case, again, is fooling herself. Anyone who thinks that the fall of the Taliban really made that not be the case is fooling herself. There have been some small advances, particularly in the northern parts of the country, less so in the south, and less so as the security situation gets worse. And so what I would actually say, it's going to sound pretty brutal, but it's been my experience as a female working in Afghanistan, is if I take the women's rights issue head on, I get backlash. The way I decided that I could best support women is economically, is helping Afghan women make a living and be the breadwinners in their families. And that then gives them de facto power that all of the agitation that I might do on women's rights issues doesn't give them. Now, that doesn't mean I don't support Afghan women who agitate for women's rights. I do, but I don't think it's helpful for international members of the international community to do that. The second point I'd like to make is that in a situation of mortal danger, rights come in second. And we are in much of the South and East in a situation of mortal danger. It's not a propitious context to work for women's rights. And that's why I don't do it directly. Because I think that first we need to get the situation, stabilized. All the things I've been talking about this afternoon. And then when there's some breathing room, that's the situation in which, people are able to start looking at the rights of downtrodden people. Finally, on the law, I think that President Karzai has been playing really base politics with this thing. Because he's trying to basically coddle a certain constituency by signing the law, while then coming to the West saying, oh, I didn't know what was in it, I'm going to prevent it from being signed. It's what he does all the time. He gives people their rights and doesn't give them enforcement power. He gives one constituency one thing and another constituency its opposite. And I think it was an extremely ugly political dynamic.
Thank you. This gentleman in the back.
Hi, Daniel Simons from the Council on Foreign Relations. I think anyone who read Punishment of Virtue knows that there's no love lost between you and someone you mentioned several times, Gul Agha Shirzai. I was curious to hear your thoughts on his political rehabilitation as governor of Nangarhar, on the positive portrayal he's received in the Western media, at least, because of, as you mentioned, his poppy eradication and improvement on some security metrics. And finally, how you see his political future unfolding.
I actually am not a personal enemy of Ghulam Shirzai, as I've told him in the past. I mean, this was a story about Kandahar, and he was the governor of Kandahar, and it was a story about warlordism, and he was the warlord governor of Kandahar. And as I told him, it's just your misfortune, Mr. Shirzai. If I had been in Herat, I would have written the same story about Ismail Khan. And so let me get that out on the table very clearly. And I think you'll have noticed that I'm at least as critical of President Karzai and his relatives as I am of Ghulam Shirzai. That being said, I think that he's an extremely clever operator. And I think what happened in moving him to Nangarhar was that he was moved to a place where he could continue to play the kind of role in support of ISI objectives that he played in Kandahar, but without it appearing so obviously. In Kandahar, Kandahar city is the strategic objective of the Taliban. So he was allowing them into the province, and then they were doing attacks in the same province, so it made him look bad. By moving him to Nangarhar, he is continuing to play that role, and I know this to be the case. In Nangarhar, high-value targets are passing through that province, and when they get arrested, he gets them released. And the way that he is making that work is by, once again, focusing on our obsession. And this is, I suspect that he is very well coached by the Pakistanis on this, because this is what they're good at, is figuring out what we're obsessed about, giving us that, and then they win our, connivance or blind eye on other stuff, just like giving us al-Qaeda operatives caused us to turn a blind eye on their orchestration of the Taliban movement. Same thing in Nangarhar now. Delivering a poppy-free province, has won a blind eye on the passing of high-value targets through the province. That's one thing. The other thing is 90% of customs revenues. 90% of probably, let's say it's 50% of $10 million a month, and that's being really conservative through that province. That's $5 million a month. You can make a lot of people happy with $5 million a month. Of course people think that, he's a great governor. He's passing out $100 bills. I looked at a report by a embedded trainer with the Afghan National Army. Eradication, first of all, there is poppy in Nangarhar. Second of all, what he's doing is a very clever double dipping, where he's diverting, he's basically not eradicating. He's taking payment for making eradication not happen. He is then reporting eradication as happening, so he's getting $1 million from us for the government-led eradication program. Meanwhile, there are opium labs and major trafficking routes through Nangarhar. So I wonder what it is that Ghulam Shirzai is doing that's so wonderful.
And adding value to poppy.
Thank you. Thank you. And so and where you see some of the positive reporting in the press about what a great guy he is, I think that falls back into this analysis of Afghanistan that I think I started out with. Tribal country and never really properly been governed, and it's always had these strong men, and here he is, a tribal strong man. This is really what Afghan culture is all about. He's a very, very effective politician. That being said, he knows how to dole out those $100 bills. I mean, a lot more articles like that in the Wall Street Journal, it's going to be pretty rosy.
Right. He's a very effective politician.
Yeah.
Gentleman next to you, and then there's one more. Yeah,
there.
Right, that's.
Yep. Brian Lowe, also CFR. I wondered if you could talk a little bit explicitly about what you think is achievable in Afghanistan over the next 5 to 10 years.
Wow. I think I've been doing that this whole afternoon. I really do. Yeah.
Okay, well, can I be more specific then? Or?
Yeah.
You'd said that you didn't like the idea of lowering the bar, like as Secretary Gates had said, like no Central Asian Valhalla. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit more about what form that would take in Afghanistan.
5 to 10 years, I think it would be possible to have a government that most of Afghan population feels is reasonably responsive and responsible, operates in a reasonably transparent fashion, in which they feel they actually have some kind of a say. I think you could do a infrastructure revolution in 5 to 10 years. And that means, not just roads, renewables. Let's get some wind generation out in southwestern Afghanistan. Let's get some solar. Why am I the first person to pilot the light industrial use of solar energy? You can put 1 megawatt of electricity of solar panels out there for $7 to $8 million. That's, not that much money. I really think Afghanistan can be dramatically transformed in 5 to 10 years with a very disciplined, multifaceted, kind of broad spectrum program. I really do.
Sir, you get the last question.
Yes, thank you. Jeroen Koreman from the Belgian Embassy here in D.C.
From the which?
Belgium.
Okay.
Over the past year, maybe a bit less this last month, but over the past year, a lot has been said about the need for more coordination of the international effort, international development agencies, UN, international NGOs, PRTs. Do you think there has been improvement there, and and what can we do to further improve?
Let me tell you, emphasize the assumption behind your question. I just met with about 25 tribal elders from the district of Jalrez in Wardak province, which is a district that's seeing a pilot in a kind of community security force. And I was talking to them in general, and their first and most repeated recommendation was you Americans should show the door to your allies because there are too many allies, they're doing too many different things, it's a rat's nest, and you're not all pulling in the same direction. They were radical. They said, get the allies out and let you Americans stand or fall on your own policy. So the problem is a very serious problem. I would say that some strides have been made. We've got a wonderful deputy chief of staff for stabilization, who is a Dutch rear admiral named Borsboom, who has been working this piece very hard in terms of comprehensive approach and getting UNAMA allies and the government of Afghanistan to the table, not just to have a meeting, but actually let's see if we can hammer out some joint approaches. I think that Ambassador Holbrooke is going to be working this very hard, and I think it's been quite interesting to watch him bring groups of ambassadors together and sort of say in a pretty historic way, you're not here just, for a social evening. Here's why you, Mr. Belgian ambassador, are here. Here is what you are contributing to this fight, and that's why I invited you. Mr. Russian ambassador, here is what you are contributing. Here is your interest in this fight, and that's why I wanted you here tonight. So he's really working very hard to forge a kind of contact group. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. All of that being said, I don't think that comprehensive approach is an end. I think we have to remember that it is a means to an end. So, for example, when I hear UNAMA saying, military, get out of governance, that's our lane, and then there is literally no UNAMA presence in, 3/4 of the Afghan East, I say that you can't do that to us. You cannot subordinate governance to your capacity. You can't subordinate the mission to your speed. And so if comprehensive approach becomes a way of bringing everybody down to the lowest common denominator, we're not going to get anywhere. So you need to kind of balance the importance of being concerted and getting on the same sheet of music with the need to forge ahead to capture this, very slender window of opportunity that's left to us. And let me just finish by saying and by repeating that we can do this. Yes, we can. We can do this. We need you. And the dangers of failure in Afghanistan are not to be underestimated. This is going to, the reason I've devoted myself to Afghanistan is not because girl reporter fell in love with wonderful exotic, Afghan landscape. It's because I genuinely believe that the character of the 21st century is going to be profoundly affected by how we do in Afghanistan. This is of critical importance, not just to the United States, but to everyone else. And speaking to you as an ally, I'll say that I've got a lot of sympathy with NATO partners who feel like, wow, we offered Article 5 back in 2001, and you guys snubbed us and said you didn't need us, and then when the going got rough, you call us all in and you foist the worst of Afghanistan on us, and now you're blaming us for failing and for not anteing up and all that stuff. I've got a lot of And meanwhile, you're giving the Pakistanis $1 billion a year, and they're using that money in part to buy bullets that kill our young men and women. And what do we need with this mission? I've got some sympathy for Europeans who might feel that way. However, I would urge you, get over it. Get over it, because this is too important. It is too important, and now we're looking at a moment of a renewed partnership with a different American approach. We need your wisdom, and we need your retired mayors. Thank you all very, very much.
I just want to second Sarah's thank to all of you, and to thank Sarah. I think you just redefined tour de force, so it was a privilege to be here and be informed by you and see your passion and insight. So thank you, and thank all of you. Yeah.